Imagine a deity with two hands operating simultaneously. One hand drives a heavy blade into a sea serpent, while the other waters a fragile vine. This sequence is the exact architecture of the 27th chapter of Isaiah. It serves as the finale to a prophetic cycle known as the Apocalypsis Jesaja, the Latin term for the little apocalypse of Isaiah. The text rests at the intersection of total judgment against cosmic evil and a moment-by-moment tenderness directed toward the faithful. Isaiah 27 functions as a unified theological architecture rather than a chronological timeline of future events, demonstrating that the destruction of evil and the cultivation of grace are the exact same divine action. The internal logic of this chapter provided the primary framework for how the early church articulated the victory of the resurrection. To understand the theology, we must ground ourselves in the geography. The prophet Isaiah is writing from Judea, a small kingdom positioned between the military superpowers of Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. The immediate historical context is the impending collapse of the northern kingdom. Around 722 BC, the capital of Samaria would be laid to waste by the Assyrian army, leaving the landscape in ruins. Scholars observe that this cycle of chapters operates on a strict thematic progression. First, a judgment of the earth. Second, songs of hope. Third, the defeat of cosmic evil. And finally, restoration. Isaiah takes the real trauma of foreign invasion and uses it as the raw material to construct a vision of the end of history. Without the historical reality of the Assyrian blade, the subsequent promise of divine protection would lose its theological weight. The chapter opens with an execution. Verse 1 describes God striking down an enemy identified by three specific titles: the fleeing Leviathan, the twisting Leviathan, and the sea monster, or Tannin. These identifiers are found outside the Bible in the Ugaritic epic of Baal. This side-by-side comparison shows the linguistic overlap. The lexical match is nearly identical. The Ugaritic terms Bethin Barich and Bethin Aklaton correspond precisely to the Hebrew Nahash Barich and Nahash Akalaton. But Isaiah performs a theological inversion. In the Ugaritic myth, this is a battle between equal cosmic forces. In Isaiah, it is a unilateral execution carried out by a singular god. The method of this execution centers on the sword. Here, a divergence appears between the two primary manuscript traditions. The Hebrew Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew scripture, describes God wielding a hard or severe sword, harbo hakasha, implying a brutal execution. The Greek Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, renders this same phrase as the holy sword, ten macheran ten achian. Jerome, the 4th century translator, theorized that the Greek translators misread the Hebrew root, swapping the word for hard, kasha, for the visually similar word for holy, kodsha. This single word shift enabled theologians like Cyril of Alexandria to identify this holy sword as the Logos, the eternal word and reason of God. In this reading, Christ himself is the blade that strikes the serpent. The patristic tradition maintains that the ancient serpent is defeated through the holy, self-sacrificial action of the cross rather than through military force. Following the death of the Leviathan, the architecture shifts from a slain monster to a protected vineyard. To understand verses 2 through 6, we must read them against the Song of the Vineyard found in Isaiah 5. The contrast is deliberate. In chapter 5, God demands fruit, finds wild grapes, and tears down the wall. In chapter 27, God himself is the keeper, watering it every moment. A textual mystery appears. The text shifts between vineyard of wine and pleasant vineyard. Regardless of the variant, the section is anchored by God's declaration in verse 4, I have no wrath. Verse 5 repeats the Hebrew word shalom, or peace, twice. This reflects a total surrender to divine grace, creating a direct theological link to Paul's doctrine of justification in Romans 5:1. The vineyard's restoration proves that after the fire of judgment, God's default posture towards his people is pure, continuous cultivation. In verses 10 and 11, we encounter a difficult structural transition. the sudden appearance of a ruined, fortified city and women gathering branches. Historical commentators like Rashi and Ephraim the Syrian identify this desolate city as an archetype for earthly pagan empires, such as Assyria or Rome. The Masoretic Hebrew text depicts a gritty scene. The branches of this ruined city have withered, and local women are coming to collect them for dry firewood. It is a picture of total historical devastation. A once impenetrable fortress has been reduced to kindling. However, the Greek Septuagint provides a translation that is almost unrecognizable when compared to the Hebrew. This concept map illustrates the divergence. Instead of women gathering wood, the Greek text on the right reads, Ginaikes erkomene apotheas, women coming from the spectacle. In this Greek rendering, the concept of lighting fires was replaced by the concept of witnessing a profound sight. Early church fathers, including Cyril and Tertullian, seized upon this specific Greek phrasing. They utilized this verse as a primary Old Testament prophecy predicting the myrrh-bearing women returning from the spectacle of the empty tomb. Cyril used this to outline a theology of reversal. Just as a woman introduced death in Genesis 3, God orchestrates history so that women are the first to herald the defeat of death. A specific textual divergence in the Greek translation became a load-bearing pillar for the early church's understanding of the resurrection witnesses. The chapter resolves with the sounding of a great trumpet and the gathering of the scattered. This trumpet blast functions as a cosmic signal vibrating across the entire universe, reaching far beyond the borders of a single nation. The text establishes vast geographical boundaries for this event, stretching from the Euphrates River down to the edge of Egypt. In contrast to the massive scale of the trumpet, the method of salvation is entirely precise. The text specifies that the people are gathered one by one. The biblical apocalypse does not resolve in a faceless mass exodus, but in an artisanal, highly individualized harvesting of souls. The Eastern Orthodox Church synthesizes this entire chapter into a single, living liturgical moment. The Lenten Paroemia, a liturgical reading from the Old Testament, deliberately bridges the terrifying judgment of chapter 26 with the slaying of the Leviathan in chapter 27. The Church positions the promise of the pleasant vineyard at the midpoint of the Great Fast to offer a psychological pivot for the faithful. This brings us back to the opening paradox. The God who wields the severe sword is the exact same God who waters the vine. In the biblical mind, these actions represent consecutive steps in the same divine process, rather than contradictory impulses. The ultimate hope of Isaiah 27 is that divine judgment is never the end of the story. It is the clearing of the ground required for grace to flourish.